Imagine the scene. You are alone, in the middle of the night, in an empty hospital. The sound of your footsteps echoes through the silent hallways, and suddenly you feel a shiver run down your spine. Something isn't right. What would you do if you knew you weren't really alone? What if I told you that the last secret I'm going to reveal in this video is the key to understanding what really hides behind the walls of this hospital? Stay with me, because you won't want to miss this reveal. Welcome to Untold Stories, the place where the scariest stories come to life and the darkest mysteries are uncovered. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe, because what's to come will make you look at hospitals in a completely different way, and maybe even make you think twice before entering any of them. Today we explore the story of a haunted hospital, where whispers of the past never stop echoing. A true journey through darkness where each corridor hides a mystery and each room, a horror story. Get ready because what you're about to hear will chill your soul. On a muggy night, the hospital was quieter than usual. The air, heavy and hot, seemed to stagnate between the empty corridors, as if the building itself were waiting for something. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting a pale light that danced on the walls, creating shadows that dragged as if they were alive. The smell of antiseptic mixed with that of rusty metal, a strange and uncomfortable combination that seemed to recall something that had been lost in the immensity of the walls, something that would never be found. It was night, but the hospital did not sleep. Its corridors, normally noisy with the sound of hurried footsteps, were now empty. Only the distant echo of a heart monitor broke the silence, but even that sound seemed fainter, as if it were moving away. Yet something was wrong. On the most secluded floor, where the patients were far from visitors and curious eyes, the silence was not the same. The place was strange, heavy, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an invisible presence. It wasn't the sound of malfunctioning equipment, or the familiar whine of the air conditioner struggling to keep the temperature cool. No, it was something deeper, more ingrained, something that came from the shadows. The lights continued to flicker, but now they seemed to reveal shapes moving quickly in the dark corners, shapes that twisted and disappeared as soon as the eye tried to reach them. With each flicker of light, it seemed as if something, or someone, was approaching. The air grew denser, colder, as if the entire hospital was trying to hide a secret that could not be shared. In the silence of the stifling night, the shadows began to stir. And while the hospital remained quiet on the outside, inside something was watching. Something was waiting. The staff had already become accustomed to that strange feeling that hung over the floor, a feeling that, even with the passing of time, never ceased to cause a certain discomfort. The silence, filled with tension, made everyone avoid talking about what they were feeling, but fear was still present, like a shadow that constantly accompanied them. When night fell, the atmosphere changed. It was as if the air became denser, heavier, and everyone could feel, even if subtly, an invisible presence watching them. The fear did not come from anything tangible, but from the feeling of being watched, as if the eyes of something unknown were fixed on them without ever blinking. The nurses, always the most attentive, were the first to notice the small details that others might ignore. As they walked through the corridors, when they approached certain rooms, the lights inside seemed to dim, as if resisting the inevitable embrace of darkness. They wondered if it was just an electrical fault, but deep down they knew there was something more. The mystery of it bothered them, and at times they swore they heard a low, almost inaudible murmur coming from inside the rooms. It was a whispering voice which seemed to be crying out for help, for something that no one else could understand. But, as much as curiosity consumed them, no one ever dared to enter those rooms. The fear of finding something that could not be explained kept them from doing so. And so the nurses continued their routines with watchful eyes and heavy hearts, trying to ignore what seemed to be a cry for help that could never be answered. The floor continued to be a place of mystery and fear, where discomfort became part of everyday life, like a shadow that no one dared to face. It was in the early hours of a Thursday that the first incident occurred. Clara, a young and nervous nurse, was making her rounds of the hospital rooms. The darkness of the night seemed even heavier in the empty and silent corridors. When she reached the room of the patient, the elderly man in serious condition, something made her hesitate. The bed was empty. The sheets, once impeccably arranged, were crumpled, as if the body had been urgently removed. Clara's heart raced. The old man could not have left alone. His health condition was critical. She ran through the corridors, her quick and uneven steps echoing throughout the hospital. But where was he? Fear was beginning to take over, mixed with the adrenaline of the situation. She could not understand what was happening. As she turned the corner, Clara stopped abruptly, her eyes fixed on the figure in front of her. There in the darkness of the corridor was the old man standing still as a statue. His eyes, once alive, were now opaque, without any expression. His skin, cold as stone, seemed as hard and lifeless as death. He did not move, did not speak, just remained in a state of total apathy. His empty gaze was fixed on a distant point on the wall, as if he were observing something that no one else could see. The nurse, still in shock, approached slowly, but something inside her prevented her from getting any closer. A shiver ran down her spine and a strange feeling enveloped her. She knew something was deeply wrong, but she couldn't understand what. The darkness around her seemed denser, and the silence more disturbing. She tried to call the patient's name, but her voice sounded weak and trembling, as if the air itself was becoming dense. The old man didn't move. The only thing Clara could perceive was a slight shivering of his skin, as if, somewhere deep inside, there was something still human in him, but unrecognizable. She didn't know what to do. The dim light in the hallway flickered, and the feeling that something supernatural was happening, something that defied logic, took over her thoughts. It was then that the man, without warning, began to walk slowly towards her. His steps were heavy and unhurried, as if time didn't exist for him. The nurse, paralyzed with fear, didn't know whether to run or stay. The silence of the night seemed to swallow all sounds around her. Clara, the old man's voice finally broke the silence, but it wasn't the voice of the patient she knew. It was something distorted, almost a whisper. She looked into his lifeless eyes and, for an instant, felt a strange and oppressive presence, as if something were watching her from behind those empty sockets. Clara was paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the man who until a few moments ago had seemed just an ordinary old man. But now, as he moved, everything seemed wrong. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, were now empty and piercing, as if something inside him had been replaced by something completely foreign. He no longer seemed human, but a grotesque creature, trapped in a body he could not control. The sound of his bones breaking and rearranging echoed through the room, a symphony of pain that made Clara shudder. With each step, his long, gnarled fingers dragged uncomfortably along the ground, and his movements had a disturbing stiffness. When the old man raised his arm, the crack was almost deafening, as if his flesh were stretching beyond its natural limits. The laughter, low and almost imperceptible, no longer came from his lips but from something deeper, a laughter that seemed to form in the entrails of a creature that should not exist. It was as if the man were being consumed by something inside him, a force that controlled his movements and distorted his soul. Clara tried to scream, but her throat felt stuck, and nothing came out except a hoarse whisper. The old man approached, his gaze fixed and empty, his body moving, but erratically. Clara tried to take a step back, but her legs were glued to the ground. His every movement made her feel a growing dread, as if she were facing something that transcended human comprehension, an entity that had already. He was no longer that old acquaintance, but an aberration that had come from a distant nightmare, and as he came closer, she knew that the only thing she could do now was wait to see what would happen next, not knowing if she would have the strength to face him. Clara was panting when she finally reached the nurse's station, her hands shaking and her face pale. The sound of her heart beating wildly seemed deafening, as if it were the only real thing in a world that now seemed to be falling apart around her. She tried to compose herself, but the vision of the old man was still fresh in her mind, that grotesque creature that had crawled closer to her with a blank, piercing gaze. I saw it. He was there. He was no longer. He was something else. Clara could barely articulate the words. She tried to hold on to the minimum of logic, but everything seemed to be dissolving. The nurse, a calm and experienced woman, looked at her with a forced smile, as if she were dealing with a case of excessive stress. "Clara, you must be seeing things. Mr. Antunes never left his room. Everyone knows that," the nurse replied in a soft voice, trying to calm her down. But Clara knew she wasn't crazy. She insisted, her voice cracking with desperation. I saw him. He was different. It wasn't Mr. Antunes. He was changed. His bones creaked. His eyes. It was something inhuman. When the doctors went to the room, Clara followed them. trying to show them where everything had happened. But when they entered the old man's room, all they found was silence. The bed was impeccably made, the air was cold, and the smell of disinfectant filled the room. The room was empty, as if nothing had happened there, as if it was all just a nightmare, an illusion of the mind of an overworked young nurse. The doctors said nothing, but their expressions were clear. Clara had lost her sanity. "It must be nerves," one of them muttered, while the other shook his head suspiciously. But Clara knew. She knew what she had seen, and she knew that no one else could understand. Something evil was there in that hospital, and now she felt its presence closer than ever. It wasn't just the old man. It wasn't just a nightmare. Something was moving in the shadows, watching her every step. Clara looked around, feeling a chill run up her spine. She wasn't alone anymore. Something was following her, something that shouldn't exist. And somehow, she knew that her life would never be the same again. Over the next few nights, the hospital seemed to have become a place where time and reality were distorted. Clara noticed changes in the patient's behavior, something that couldn't be explained, but that was becoming increasingly disturbing. With each shift, more and more nurses were called to attend to agitated patients, all talking about the same things. Some would mutter incomprehensible words in the middle of the night, as if they were talking to something invisible. Their voices were low, slurred, and Clara felt a chill in her stomach whenever she heard the words spoken, as if a sinister mystery were being whispered there, right in front of her. There were also those who, with their eyes wide with fear, would point to the walls of the room, staring at a random spot as if something were there, waiting. But when Clara tried to look, all she saw were the blank white walls, the muffled silence of the night. However, when she looked closer, she could swear that something was moving at the edges of her field of vision. It was a shadow, a subtle, indistinct figure that disappeared whenever she tried to focus on it. But deep down, Clara knew that it was not an illusion. Something was there, something that should not be. She could feel its presence, as if something were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the days passed, the patient's reports became more specific. They spoke of someone, a figure that lurked in the shadows and watched them with hungry eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Some described the figure as a being with pale skin and deep-set eyes, others as a shadow that stretched up the walls and dissolved into the cracks of darkness. But they all seemed to agree on one thing. This entity was there, lurking, just waiting. The nurses, who had previously been skeptical, began to grow restless. Clara could no longer sleep well. Images of moving shadows haunted her thoughts, and the nights grew longer and longer. The feeling that the hospital was gradually being taken over by something dark and uncontrollable grew with each new shift. Every furtive glance through the darkened windows or down the empty hallways seemed to bring a new sense of dread. The fear came not only from the disturbed patients, but from the invisible presence itself that seemed to haunt the place. And then one night during her shift, Clara found herself alone in the hallway. The sound of the wind blowing through the broken windows was the only noise, but something seemed wrong. As she passed one of the rooms, she saw, in the corner of the doorway, a shadow moving slowly. Clara's heart raced, but she didn't stop. She knew what she had seen. Something was approaching, and now, more than ever, she felt that the hospital was a place where no one was safe. The nights would never be the same again. Those walls no longer offered safety. The tension in the hospital was becoming unbearable. The lights, which had previously flickered sporadically, now failed frequently, leaving the hallways plunged into brief periods of darkness. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows seemed to mix with the murmurs of the patients, creating a dense, heavy atmosphere, as if the air itself was filled with something that shouldn't be there. The corridors, which had previously seemed short and well lit, now stretched on endlessly as if space were being distorted in some way, leaving everyone with the feeling that the hospital was becoming a maze with no way out. In the early hours of that Friday, when the shadows were deepest and the stillness of the place most unsettling, the worst happened. Nurse Carla, already exhausted after a long shift, was getting ready for the shift change. It was a cold night, and the silence seemed to swallow everything around her. She entered the patient's room, a young man who had been fighting a terminal illness for months. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling in an irregular rhythm. Carla's heart sank when she saw him there, his pale skin and labored breathing, a cruel reminder of how close death was. She approached to adjust the devices monitoring his condition, but when she looked at him, something made her hesitate. His eyes, which should have been closed or at least half closed due to fatigue, were completely white. There were no irises, no pupils, only a ghostly opacity that reflected emptiness, as if the life had drained from him abruptly and cruelly. Dread took hold of Carla. She took a step back, trying to understand what was happening, but before she could react, an icy hand, cold as the touch of a corpse, grabbed her wrist. The sensation was terrifying, as if the bones in her hand were being compressed by a force beyond her comprehension. She tried to scream, but her throat closed, fear paralyzing her vocal cords. That was when she heard it, a low, drawn-out voice, like a whisper coming from the depths of a dark cave. "You're going to be too." The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. The air around her became heavy, suffocating, and a feeling of absolute cold enveloped her. She looked at the patient, but his eyes were no longer empty. Now they were eyes of deep darkness, eyes that observed her with a macabre calm, as if he knew something she did not yet understand. What Carla did not know, what no one knew, was that the man was no longer among the living. He had been taken, possessed, and the shadow that controlled him now turned to her. She felt the cold hand grip her wrist tighter, and then, as if she had been freed from a spell, the man began to breathe again with the same difficulty as before. His eyes returned to those of a normal human being, but the feeling of terror that enveloped the nurse did not disappear. She ran out of the room, panic consuming her, but deep down she knew that something had changed in that hospital. That entity, or whatever it was, had now marked her. The whisper, "You'll be too," reverberated in her mind, and Carla knew that the hospital was now a place where the dead and the living coexisted in a way no human being should ever experience. And with each passing day, the darkness seemed to spread a little further. Carla tried to pull away, but the strength of the hand that gripped her was indescribable. It was as if the patient's fingers, now more like claws, had turned to iron, crushing her wrist with a pressure that seemed unreal. Her breathing became ragged, and despite her efforts to escape, her body seemed to be pulled into something deeper, something she could not understand. Panic overcame her, and she fought against the growing despair, her legs shaking as her mind tried to understand the impossible. Suddenly, the patient's body began to convulse violently. His muscles contracted grotesquely, as if something were possessing him from within, forcing him into erratic, frantic movements. The man's face was distorted in an expression of pain and fear, but behind those expressions, Carla swore she saw something else. A dark presence watching her from within the patient's eyes. Terror washed over her like a wave, and she screamed for help, her voice coming out strangled and desperate. When the other nurses finally rushed into the room, what they found was absolute silence. The patient's body was no longer there. The bed was empty, the covers scattered in a disorderly manner as if someone had been ripped from it with some supernatural force. The room, which had previously been muffled by the sound of Carla's convulsions and screams, now seemed strange, as if an invisible curtain of calm had fallen over the room. But the most frightening thing was the patient's disappearance. He, who should have been strapped to the bed with the machine still on, had simply disappeared, as if he had never been there. There were no signs of struggle, of movement, nothing. The hospital was once again in a deep silence, but now this silence was worse than the previous chaos. Something had happened, and no one knew what it was. Terror spread through the hospital like wildfire. The nurses, doctors, and even the patients began to talk about what had happened, their voices low but filled with fear. Some whispered about vengeful spirits. Others spoke of an ancient curse that hung over the place, an energy that should never have been awakened. But no one knew the truth. What was happening here, in the cold and unforgiving walls of the hospital, was beyond comprehension. As the days passed, the tension only increased. The lights continued to flicker, the shadows seemed denser, and the whispers in the hallways became more and more constant. The patients who had been calm before now began to have strange crises, convulsions, and hallucinations, many claiming to see shadowy figures watching them. Some even swore they could feel icy hands touching their skin, as if the entity that had possessed the patient was now looking for more victims. Carla no longer knew what to think. The hospital, which had previously been just a place of work, now seemed like a labyrinth of mysteries and indescribable horrors. She knew that something evil was there, something that could not be explained or rationalized. And even more terrifying, she felt that it didn't matter where she hid. That presence followed her, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. While the hospital was becoming a place of fear and despair, An ancient and evil presence lurked deep within the building, on the oldest floor, where no employee dared to set foot. This floor, lost in time and neglected for years, was marked by decay. The walls, covered in mold and cracks, seemed to whisper long-buried secrets, and the smell of damp and old age filled the air, making it dense and heavy, as if the hospital itself were breathing. And in the shadows of this place something was watching. With red and hungry eyes, the entity that lived there seemed to see through the walls, the corridors, the rooms. It didn't need to move to be everywhere at once. Its presence was constant, invisible but impossible to ignore. It was as if the very structure of the hospital was part of it, as if every brick, every beam, every strand of light was being controlled by a sinister will, waiting for the right moment to devour those who dared to approach. Every day, more and more patients disappeared without a trace. Nurses, doctors, and even security guards who entered the old floor to investigate never returned. Some said they heard muffled screams. Others reported a feeling of extreme cold that enveloped them when they crossed the threshold of the floor, as if something was waiting for them. But when the superiors sent teams to investigate, the floor was always empty, its corridors abandoned and completely silent, as if no one had ever been there. Over time, paranoia began to consume the hospital staff. Suspicious glances crossed the corridors, and whispers about what was happening in the depths of the hospital spread. The psychological pressure was immense, and the line between reality and imagination became increasingly blurred. They knew they were being watched. They could feel the red, hungry eyes watching them, but none of them could escape this feeling. Every noise in the night, every slight movement in the shadows, made their hearts race, and the tension grew with each passing day. Some began to miss work, others requested transfers, but no one escaped. Even the most skeptical, those who tried to rationalize the strange disappearances and bizarre events, could no longer ignore what was happening. The oldest floor of the hospital was becoming a living legend, and the terror of knowing that something was watching them all the time was unbearable. The entity, which seemed to be present in every corner of the hospital, waited patiently. Its goal was not only to consume the victims who fell into its trap, but to spread fear, to corrode the sanity of those who dared to remain. And with each new disappearance, the hospital became more and more empty, its structure even more fragile, as if it were being swallowed from within. Something evil, older than the building itself, was about to awaken completely, and no one, no human being, could escape. Each night the hospital became emptier, more silent, but the terror that lived there only grew. More people disappeared, vanished without a trace. Panic gripped the place, and what was once a care center turned into a nightmare that no one wanted to be in. With each new disappearance, another. The puzzle of terror fell into place, and those who remained seemed to lose themselves, consumed by unease and uncertainty. No one wanted to work at the hospital anymore. Positions were not being filled as quickly as they had been, and the few remaining employees seemed to be on the verge of collapse. When new employees arrived, they were greeted by exhausted colleagues, their eyes glazed over, staring off into the distance, as if they were staring at something the others could not see. The exhaustion was written all over their faces, but the fear was even more present, hidden in the shadows of their expressions. They could barely look each other in the eye, as if simple eye contact was a cruel reminder that somewhere in that hospital, something was watching them, waiting. The atmosphere was stifling. The smell of mold and disinfectant mixed with the heavy, cold air of the endless corridors. The walls, covered in mold and cracks, seemed to expand and contract, as if the hospital itself were alive, breathing and waiting for the right moment to swallow everything around it. Every corner, every room, every hallway seemed to have been consumed by darkness, as if the shadows were coming to life, expanding and taking over the space. Some of the new employees, the bravest, tried to resist the panic. They tried to ignore the whispers of their colleagues, the blank stares and the muffled screams that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the hospital. But over time, even the most determined began to succumb. The nights dragged on endlessly, and the feeling of being watched, of something waiting to attack them, took over their thoughts. Those who tried to escape, who tried to leave the hospital forever, were never seen again. The ones who stayed, those who could not leave the place, faced the inevitable. They knew that the hospital would not let them go, would not let them leave unharmed. Each breath was an effort, each step in the empty corridors a battle against panic. They knew that the hospital was devouring their minds, their strength, their souls. With each passing day they felt emptier, more disconnected from what was left of their old lives. They were losing themselves, as if the hospital were a living entity, slowly swallowing everything around them, even the bravest souls. The place had become an abyss, and everyone who ventured there knew that they were destined to be consumed. The hospital, with its moldy walls and endless corridors, was an endless prison, and its victims were destined to disappear into the darkness, with no one knowing where they had gone or what was really happening there. The terror was not just in the walls, it was in the people. It was inside them. In the cold dawns, when the wind cut through the silence and whispered through the cracks in the windows, something terrible began to manifest itself. The sound of evil laughter echoed through the empty hallways, a low, drawn-out, distorted laugh, as if hundreds of voices had mingled into one sinister cackle that spread to every corner of the hospital. It was a sound that no one wanted to hear, but that everyone felt reverberating in their bones, as if the very structure of the building was being consumed by something beyond comprehension. Something was waiting. Something that had been released the moment the first stones of the building were laid. The hospital, once a place of healing, recovery, and hope, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Its walls no longer reflected light, but absorbed it, swallowed it, as if they were made of flesh and bone instead of stone and cement. The air grew denser by the day, heavier, and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen never left those who lived there. The hospital was no longer a place of treatment. It was a prison, a dark abyss, a place where death was the only way out. With each passing night, the number of disappearances increased, and the souls that were lost there were enslaved by an invisible force, a force that fed on their fears, their anguish, their lives. They were devoured one by one, without mercy, with no chance of escape. With each step, the hospital swallowed another piece of the humanity of those who were still alive until, over time, everyone began to lose themselves, without realizing that they were no longer the same people who had once entered there. The most terrifying thing of all was that those who fell into the clutches of this evil entity never returned. Their bodies disappeared, but their essences were consumed, enslaved in an eternal prison where the torment had no end. The evil laughter seemed to grow louder as the days passed, a cruel reminder that those who had been taken could no longer be rescued. The hospital staff began to realize that the place was not just a building, but something much darker. They could no longer trust what they saw. Time seemed to distort. The hours dragged on, and with each shift, the fear grew. Those who tried to run, who tried to ignore what was happening, soon found themselves trapped like rats in a trap, unable to escape the force that had been unleashed. The hospital, with its cracked walls and endless corridors, became a bottomless pit, a spiral of suffering and despair where souls were consumed and enslaved one by one. What had once been a place of healing was now a machine of death, a prison that devoured those who dared enter it, never giving them the chance to break free. And so, night after night, the evil laughter echoed through the halls, reminding everyone that in the hospital, the only possible destination was darkness, and no one would ever return from there.